So group the quantitative designs. I don't know if you did some work. If you didn't, then we can go to the next group. Yes, Godfrey.
Tracy, please, you can share the screen. Good morning, members. This is group 4, and I request Sarah to please take over and now come in.
Yes, good morning, members. This is group 4, and we're looking at the quantitative study designs. So the objectives under our discussion, we shall look at after developing a research question, what do we do next? We shall see that we have to achieve the objectives of the research. Then to see that we answer the question as to which our research is being carried out. Then we shall look at the different strengths and limitations of the study designs, of the different study designs, and also understand the differences between study designs and use of appropriate study designs to answer specific. Okay, so a study design is a specific plan or protocol for conducting the study. And this allows the researcher or the investigator to translate the conceptual hypothesis into an operation. Conceptual, like as you hear the word from the concept now, it ceases to be just mere concepts, and now it comes to practice or operation. We can continue to the next slide. So let's look at the types of study designs. We are seeing that we have the observation and non-observation. And observation, these are study designs that do not involve any intervention, like someone just sits and observes. Maybe at your work of place, you want to see how your workers do perform. You sit and observe instead of maybe going asking them, for how many hours have you worked today? You just sit somewhere and observe how they perform. Then under non-observation, studies that entail manipulation of study factors, like the exposures, and may also involve randomization of subjects to treatment. Let's continue. Yeah, and observational, we have the cross-section, ecological, cohort, and case control. We shall be looking at them in details. Then intervention, these are the randomized and non-randomized. We have the clinical trials and community intervention trials. Let's continue, Godfrey. So let's look at come back. Let's look at the cross-section study. I think you've missed out something. Let's go back a little. Yeah, it's a study conducted at a single point of time. And under this, data is collected and analyzed relating to persons in a population or group within a defined period of time, with particular references to their disease status, individual characteristics, and the exposure to factors which are thought to predispose them to diseases. Exposure and disease measured at the same time, like you look at the exposure and the disease at the same time as you're carrying on your research. and often sample of the general population collected. Okay. Fine, let's continue and look at the advantages. You'll excuse me, my voice is kind of coarse. Yeah, please, okay, examples. Yeah, we have a few examples here. Oh my. Let's look at the examples, please. Whoever is sharing the screen. Examples. Fine. Okay. Advantages. We are saying that it is relatively inexpensive and can be conducted over a short time. Like this doesn't require you to go back time and again to look for data. You go once in the population and collect the data. So we are saying that it is inexpensive. It is not that costly and it will not take much of your time. Then results can be easily generalized. And we are saying that samples are randomly selected. Let's continue, please. Then let's look at the disadvantages. Under the disadvantage, it is not efficient for rare diseases where large samples are required. Then it is not good for diseases of short duration. Diseases with short durations are not good for this cross-section study design, whereby you can miss out on the characteristics of such diseases. Then it is difficult to establish temporal sequence. It cannot separate causes and effects. It excludes those who die or get cured quickly, since data is collected once in the population. Then it cannot measure disease incidence. Then let's look at when to conduct a cross-sectional study. A cross-section study can be conducted when the focus of the study is to determine the distribution of the disease. Like it is useful for health planning. You saw that the disease is distributed in the population. How fast does it spread? What are the characteristics of the disease? And it helps you to plan as a health worker. Then when the exposure or outcome are not rare. Also, it can be conducted when one wants to generate hypotheses linking exposure and outcome. I think at this juncture, allow me invite my colleagues to take on.
Thank you, Sarah.
So maybe can I say something before you go?
Yes,
to
please.
the next? So when we are talking about quantitative designs, we are definitely talking about relationships between the dependent and independent variables. We want to quantify this relationship in terms of its strength or in terms of its association. And so the key things is, how do we determine the variables? First of all, what are we interested in finding? Are we interested in finding out the dependent variable, that's the outcome? Or are we interested in finding out the independent variable or the exposure? So our beginning point determines the type of design that we want. If you want to construct a church, you'll be like, oh, should I first put off a roof, put poles, put a roof, then construct the wall and a foundation later? Or begin from the foundation, go systematically up the roof? So anyhow, it works, whether you start from looking out for exposure, then find out the outcome, or looking out for the outcome. You know the outcome, you look out for the exposure. There are also instances whereby you don't know any of them. As in, you don't know the outcome, you don't know the exposure. And you're going to look for these things at the same time. You're going to look for all these variables at the same time. Now, for a cross-sectional study, the reason why they call it a cross-sectional study, it is because that we do not know the outcome, neither do we know the exposure. We don't know the independent variable, and we don't know the dependent variable. So we go in the field to look out for these things at the same time. Let us say you go to a community, you don't know the prevalence of malaria. At the same time, you don't know the risk factors that are associated with the prevalence of malaria in that particular society. So you go and ask people one by one. You ask both the outcome and exposure. Have you suffered malaria in the last 1 week? Yes or no? So first question, you're asking for the outcome, whether somebody has suffered malaria. Then you ask for the exposure. Do you sleep under mosquito net? Yes or no? Do you sleep near a swampy area? Yes or no? Are you pregnant? Yes or no? So in this case, you find out that if you interview 100 people, then you find out that out of 100 people interviewed, maybe 20 of them have reported that they have ever suffered malaria. So you can say, oh, in this society, the prevalence of malaria is 20%. And then now you go and analyze the outcome as well. You go and analyze the outcome as well, and then you tell the world that, okay, in this particular case, what we have is that among the people who had malaria, maybe 5 of them didn't have what? Malaria. So at the end of it all, you're able to come up with the judgment that in this population, most of the people who had suffered malaria were not sleeping under a mosquito net. So in that case, you will, could you unshare the slides a little bit? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I'm saying unshare the slides. Somebody will share the slides. Okay, thank you. So in this case, what we are going to come up with, we are going to come up with something, let's say, let me look out for my screen. My thing is not accepting to type. I wanted to type something here on the whiteboard. Host, can you allow me? I don't know if there is a section for writing. I wanted to write, to use this whiteboard, but eventually it is not. The whiteboard is not, is inactive.
Let me just make you the host, then let's see whether you can do it.
Let's try to make me the host, and I see if the whiteboard can be activated. So I think this link is not, it's not allowing us to do that. But what I wanted to do was to then show you how we could run this analysis. Okay, maybe what we can do is okay, I get it now. So this is what I was saying, that you now go to, if you go to this society and you are looking for two outcomes at the same time. So we have people, let us say that you're looking for malaria, and so you found those ones who are negative. Sorry. Let me first have this. So we're looking for our outcome was malaria. So we shall have people who are positive in their society, then there are others who will be negative. So we are asking for, let us say our thing was use of mosquito nets. So there are those who said yes, and there are those who said no. So in this case, let us assume that the people who said yes were A, those ones were B, C, and D. Such that this side we have our total. So the total number of people who said yes using nets would be A plus B. Then those who are not using mosquito nets would be C plus D. And then the total number of people who have malaria coming downwards would be A plus C. And then those who do not have malaria would be B plus D. So in this case, we are able to tell that among the people who were using mosquito nets, yes, how many of them suffered malaria and how many did not suffer? Among the people who said they were not using mosquito nets, how many of them had malaria when they're not using mosquito nets? And how many of them who were not using mosquito nets had malaria? And so in this case, we are able to what? To compare. And this is called a 2x2 table. It's called a 2x2 table, or we call it a contingency table. So we're able to analyze that in this society, we can report now. So we can find the odds of, I know you've done this in biostat. So we discussed this. So we can find the odds of, or the odds of suffering malaria given that you are sleeping under a mosquito net, or the odds of suffering malaria given that you did not sleep under mosquito nets. So if you find that the odds of sleeping under mosquito nets were much, so the odds of having malaria given that people were sleeping under a mosquito net was higher than the odds of suffering malaria, given that you did not sleep under a mosquito net, then we can question the effectiveness of the mosquito net. But obviously, if we would find that people who slept under mosquito nets had the lower odds of getting malaria compared with those who did not sleep under a mosquito net. Or we may also find that there is no difference whether people slept under mosquito nets or did not sleep under mosquito nets. There may be no difference. So we come up with this information. Now the challenge about cross-sectional studies, I think the colleagues have said. You mentioned something about temporal relationships. I didn't understand it well. What was it? What's a temporal relationship? So if you go to this society, and then let us assume that you are studying in this particular example that you have of sleeping under a mosquito net, you will not know whether somebody slept under a mosquito net, then got malaria, or somebody got malaria, then went to sleep under a mosquito net. It is possible that somebody went to the trading center, he was bitten by the mosquitoes in the trading center when he was not under the mosquito net. Then when he comes inside, he enters the mosquito net when he already has what? When he already has the malaria. And so when you ask this person will tell you, me, I sleep under mosquito net, but I'm still suffering what? Suffering from malaria. So in that particular case, we cannot know what came before the other. Is it malaria that came before before sleeping under mosquito net, or the other way around? An example could be if you go to a society and you're studying about education and poverty. You ask people, and then they tell you, me, I'm poor because I did not go to school. So in that case, you'll find that it is lack of education that caused poverty. But another person can say, for me, I did not go to school because I'm poor. So the question would be, lack of education and poverty, which one causes the other? You know, is it lack of education that causes poverty, or poverty causes lack of education? Stuart, what would be your argument?
It can be either way.
So it can be either way. So you cannot know what caused the other. So that's the disadvantage about a cross-sectional studies. We cannot verify this temporal relationship. But what we can only say, yes, this society people are poor because of this, but we cannot know what caused the other. So that's the challenge about temporal relationships in a cross-sectional study. Then, have you heard when COVID-19 came and Museveni used to address the nation, did you ever hear anything about the prevalence of malaria? Also the prevalence of COVID-19? Either from the newspaper, from the minister, any bulletin. Did you ever hear anything like, okay, the prevalence of COVID-19 is like this? Anyone?
No.
So the question is why? Why didn't they report anything to do with the prevalence of COVID-19?
Of course, since COVID is newly discovered, there were no old cases. So that's why they were talking about the incidence of COVID-19.
It is because COVID-19 has a shorter duration. It has a shorter duration. People recover in 2 days, 5 days, one others go. So the recovery rate for COVID-19 is actually high. So in these cases, when the disease has a shorter duration, you cannot talk about prevalence, because if you report this week the number of cases plus the old ones, the old ones have already recovered. You get no new cases. So when the disease has a shorter duration, like for COVID, the measure of reporting is incidence. So they would always report cumulative number of cases occurring, but you wouldn't hear anything to do with the prevalence. So cross-sectional studies by nature, they are called prevalence studies. Prevalence studies, because they are just looking at numbers available, old and new, and they cannot assess incidence. Okay, so that's a little bit I wanted to add to the discussion. We can continue.
Someone had a question, say, he wanted to know the difference between cross-sectional study and case study from the chat.
Between a cross-sectional study and a case study. Case study, yesterday we said you're looking at one person. That is a case which is unique. But for a cross-sectional study, you're looking at general population. And in a case study, there's something that you're looking out for from this person. You're following this person over time. It's a longitudinal kind of a study that is following one person, or you're studying just one individual. And in this case, it's you're just assessing somebody for a certain outcome or no outcome. But for cross-sectional studies, you're taking the population, the general population at risk in a society, in a certain given community. Okay, so we can continue with the ecological studies.
Another question is asking, where do we categorize people who put, like, for example, the case of the net, sometimes they put, sometimes they don't. Where do you categorize?
Pardon?
Where do you categorize people who sometimes are exposed to the risk factor and the other times are not exposed to the risk factor? For example, the 2x2 table. Sometimes it's a yes, sometimes it's a no.
That's the weakness of a cross-sectional study. So when you are going to ask your questions, you put a time frame. You ask somebody, did you sleep under a mosquito net yesterday? So somebody is able to remember whether they slept yesterday or not. But if you ask somebody a question, do you sleep under a mosquito net? It is obvious that some days they sleep, some days they don't. So you must put a time frame such that you be specific on the timelines. So your question will determine whether this person will sleep under a mosquito net or not. Or if you ask a question like that, do you sleep under mosquito nets? You give somebody options to say either never, every day, or sometimes. So you can have 3 categories of people who say sometimes, people who say every day, then those who say never.
Excuse me, Mr. Jallo.
Yes, please.
Yes, still on a case study. There's somewhere you said yesterday that, for example, if you're studying a group of, say, a group of a community or a group of people, but with a unique character, and you're pointing out at a specific character that you want to study. Does it put it at a case study? Does it also qualify to be under case study, or it is still a case study?
No, it remains a case study. Case study. It remains a case study. You know, in a cross-sectional study, you're looking at a number of variables that affect one outcome. You have one general outcome, and you're looking at a number of variables that affect that one general outcome. Now, in a case study, where